My name is Logan Pierce, and as I walk through the doors of Redmond and Sons Construction this morning, the familiar rumble of machinery and the scent of sawdust greet me like loyal companions. For the past 10 years, I have devoted every waking hour to building this company's reputation, logging 80-hour weeks, skipping family gatherings, and turning down better offers, all out of loyalty to the Redmond name and faith in the vision my father-in-law, Gerald Redmond, entrusted me with. I married Isla Redmond straight out of college, believing that by joining her family, I was forging a bond based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Gerald, a man who believed that trust was earned through sweat and craftsmanship, welcomed me into his world, gave me his confidence, and enabled me to rise from an eager graduate to his company's most trusted project manager. I believed I had earned his respect. I believed I had earned my place. 2 days ago, I was in the office late, bent over billing statements for a presentation I would give to the board next week. The overhead lights glowed harshly against the concrete floor as I flipped through manila folders labeled for various sites: Morley, Mitchell, Bristol. Exhaustion weighed on my eyelids, but I pressed on, determined to ensure every cost estimate was accurate. That's when I noticed a folder tucked behind others with a tab crudely labeled Ownership Transfer, Paul. My heart pounded as I slid it out, certain it was misplaced, but the legal agreement inside was unmistakable. 75% of Redmond and Sons belonged to Paul Redmond, Gerald's youngest child, with the remainder held only by Gerald and his wife Miriam. My name, Logan Pierce, did not appear. No mention of a decade's worth of blood, sweat, or hours I had poured into this company. The revelation burned hotter than welding torches in midsummer, and I knew in that instant that my life's work had built someone else's throne. I left the office with that folder in my hand and a silence in my throat. Driving home felt unreal. Each stoplight was a hammer striking my confidence. When I arrived at our house, Isla greeted me at the door with a warm smile that failed to reach her eyes. In the kitchen, Miriam was preparing roast chicken, Isla's favorite, and Gerald was reviewing blueprints at the dining table. I set the folder down heavily between them without a word. The clicking knives and clinking silverware stopped. Isla's fork hovered midair, eyes wide. Gerald's face went ashen. I watched as Isla slowly opened the manila flap and drew out the damning papers. The room seemed to hold its breath as the truth spread from paper to her face. "Isla, what is this?" I asked, voice measured but taut with disbelief. She swallowed hard, her lip trembling. "Logan, it's not what you think," but Gerald cut him before she could finish. "Logan, Paul is our blood. He deserves the company." My hands curled into fists. "I've been here since 2015. I brought clients in when we were barely breaking even. I saved this company from bankruptcy," I said, each word precise, each fact undeniable. "Blood doesn't earn payments, work does. I sacrificed birthdays, missed holidays, and built relationships that kept this place afloat. And for all of that, I get nothing?" Silence hung heavy until I stood. If Paul owns it, Paul can run it. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out, the echo of my footsteps following me to the front door. On Monday, I did not show up at the office. My cell phone buzzed nonstop with messages from colleagues. "Where's the site audit report? Client meeting Thursday? Are you prepared?" I did not answer. When Gerald called on Tuesday to demand I return for a crucial meeting on the Mitchell site, I said only, "Ask Paul. He's the owner now." Then I turned off my phone and slept later than I had in years. For the first time, I ate breakfast without checking my inbox, stared at the ceiling without mental blueprints dancing in my head, and let silence replace the cacophony of deadlines and demands. I questioned everything. Was I really loyal, or was I afraid to leave? On Wednesday, I met with Jared Lowe, a former colleague who had left Redmond and Sons to start his own firm 5 years ago. Jared greeted me with a smile that was warmer than any welcome I received from the Redmond family in recent months. "Logan, I've watched everything you did at Redmond. You ran that company when they refused to see your value. Come join me," he said, and his words struck me like a punch I hadn't realized I needed. I listened as he described the role. Director of Operations, a salary beyond Gerald's offer, shares in his new venture, and, most important, respect. He saw what I'd built. That night, I began documenting every achievement I had brought to Redmond and Sons. The major clients I'd convinced to stay after 2019, the efficiency systems I'd implemented in 2020 that cut costs by millions, the ways I negotiated with suppliers last year to reduce material waste. Meanwhile, Paul was busy hosting creative meetings at local breweries, a fact I confirmed through whispers in the industry grapevine. My resignation letter took shape in my head. Effective immediately, redirect all inquiries to Paul Redmond. No bitterness, just facts. On Thursday morning, I delivered the letter to the receptionist, watching her face flush as she read it before slipping it onto Gerald's desk. As I walked out of Redmond and Sons for the final time, the sun shone brightly above the construction yard, a cruel contrast to the darkness inside me. Word of my departure reached Macklin Price, CEO of Priceworks Construction and Redmond's largest client, by Friday. He called Gerald to complain about Paul's mismanagement and to confess that he would have followed me anywhere. I learned this through a brief text from Jared. Clients respect you, Logan, not Redmond and Sons. That evening, Gerald appeared at my apartment door, tie askew and face pale from stress. He pounded on the door until I let him in. Paul doesn't understand permits. He's botched the Bristol quote. Macklin is threatening to pull out. I need you back, he pleaded. I sat calmly on the edge of my sofa, steepling my fingers. You handed my life's work to your son. He has the crown. Let him wear the weight, I replied. He offered to double my salary. I shook my head. Chain me to this company if you like, but I will not work for free. He swallowed and finally asked, What do you want? I stated my terms plainly. 40% ownership, a board seat, standard hours, no more 80-hour Sentinel shifts. He scoffed. That's not possible. I watched as reality settled over him. Either acknowledge my worth or watch Redmond and Sons collapse. Saturday morning, Jared's offer became official. The paperwork described a generous salary, directorship responsibilities, and equity in the company. I gave Gerald 48 hours to respond to my counteroffer. 35% ownership of Redmond and Sons, control over operations, an official title, and defined boundaries. On Sunday evening, Isla came to my door, tears in her eyes. You're destroying this family, she whispered. I shook my head. Your father destroyed it when he gave my decade of sacrifice to your brother. I'm not the cancer here. She said nothing, because she knew the truth. I wasn't the problem, I was the backbone no one saw. Late Sunday night, Gerald called to accept my terms. The next day, we met at a neutral lawyer's office, Gerald, Miriam, Paul, Isla, and our attorneys. Paul looked uncomfortable, drowning in responsibilities he was never trained for. By the end of the meeting, I had 35% ownership, operational control, and a defined title. Redmond and Sons would be co-led. Paul handling creative strategy, me managing execution. Finally, the company had structure, and I had peace. Now, months later, I walk into Redmond and Sons with clarity. Clients have returned, operations run efficiently, and staff morale is palpable. Paul and I, unlikely partners, coexist in mutual respect. One morning over coffee, he admitted quietly, You were right to walk away. I nodded. I didn't need an apology. I only needed respect. That Sunday, at family dinner, Gerald raised his glass and said, To Logan for showing us what true leadership looks like. It wasn't much, but it was enough, because I finally owned my seat at the table, and I will never work for free again. I sat at my desk late into the night, the hum of the air conditioning and the glow of the monitor my only companions. The site reports had piled up, but it was the billing discrepancies that caught my attention. Numbers that didn't add up, clients that were supposedly invoiced twice or not at all. I was used to fixing other people's messes, to being the one everyone leaned on when projects went sideways, but this was different. A feeling itched at the base of my spine, a suspicion that someone was taking more than they were giving. My fingers drummed on the desk as I opened yet another folder, this one thicker than the rest, its tab marked with the label, Ownership Transfer, Paul. A chill ran through me. My hands hesitated for a split second, a breath caught in my throat, and then I pulled it open. Inside was a neatly typed legal agreement, terms and signatures that felt like a blade at my ribs. I read it once, then twice, my eyes scanning the lines as if willing them to change. 75% of Redmond and Sons construction would transfer to Paul Redmond, effective immediately. The rest would remain with Gerald and Miriam Redmond. There was no mention of me. No recognition for the 10 years I'd spent building this company's backbone. No appreciation for the clients I'd landed. No thanks for the hundreds of nights I'd missed with Isla. All because I was too busy saving someone else's dream. It was like I'd been erased, a ghost in a place where I'd spent more time than in my own home. My hands trembled as I set the document down. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting a sterile glow that only made the betrayal sharper. I felt like a fool, a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. Gerald had always said trust was earned, that respect was given to those who put in the hours, who sweated and bled for the cause. I'd believed him. Every time he'd clapped me on the back after a successful pitch, every time he'd praised my management of the Mitchell site, every time he'd called me son over barbecue at his house, I'd believed him. And now I saw it for what it was, a lie wrapped in a family name. I stood, the rolling chair scraping harshly against the floor. My legs felt like lead as I picked up the folder, its edges sharp against my palm. I walked down the hallway past photos of smiling faces, Gerald in front of a newly framed house, Isla with her first hard hat, Paul shaking hands with a developer. None of them featured me. I wasn't family. I was the workhorse they rode to the finish line. I paused at Gerald's office door, the glass etched with his name and title like a trophy. The door was locked. Figures. I wasn't supposed to see this. I stepped outside into the humid night air. The city was quiet, the skyline glowing in the distance like a promise I'd never kept. My truck sat in the parking lot, the same one I'd bought to haul lumber and equipment, and suddenly it felt like an extension of my prison. I climbed in, shut the door, and just sat there with the folder in my lap. I thought about all the times Isla had packed me a lunch, telling me how proud she was. How many times had I told her I couldn't make dinner because Gerald needed me on site? How many birthdays had I missed? I thought about the nights I'd come home late, exhausted, only to find her asleep on the couch waiting for me. I felt a tightness in my chest, a weight I hadn't let myself acknowledge. I wasn't just angry. I was heartbroken. Not because of the company, though that was a betrayal I couldn't fully process yet, but because I believed so deeply in this family, in the idea that my work, my loyalty, would be repaid with the same respect I'd given them. That belief had kept me chained to a promise that was never real. The folder crinkled in my grip. I started the truck, the engine rumbling to life with a vibration that felt like a defibrillator. I needed to move, to get away from the site, the office, the place where I'd invested everything and found nothing. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I took the long way home, winding through streets lined with construction sites I'd overseen, buildings that wouldn't exist without me. I wondered how many of them Paul had even set foot on. When I finally parked in front of our house, the porch light was on. Isla was waiting. She opened the door as I stepped onto the porch, her eyes tired but warm. "You're late," she said, her voice soft. I held up the folder, the only explanation I had. Her brows furrowed as she took it from me, flipping it open. Her face fell. "Logan, I didn't know," she stammered, but I saw the doubt in her eyes, the conflict between her loyalty to her father and her love for me. "It's okay. I lied, because I didn't know how to process the truth. I need to think." She tried to reach for me, but I pulled away, stepping inside to the living room that felt less like a home and more like a museum of choices I couldn't take back. I dropped my keys on the table, the clatter echoing through the quiet house. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Gerald's smile, Paul's laugh, Miriam's polite nods. I heard the conversations they'd had without me, the decisions they'd made as if I were an afterthought. I wondered how long they'd been planning this transfer. Had Gerald always seen me as temporary, a stepping stone for his son? Had Isla known? I thought of every time she defended her brother's creative ideas, every time she'd said, "Paul just needs a little guidance." I couldn't escape the feeling that I'd been the only one playing by the rules in a game designed to exclude me. I'd worked harder than anyone, bled for this company, and yet I was disposable. The thought made my blood boil, but beneath the anger was a hollow ache that I couldn't name. I got up before dawn and showered, the water scalding but not hot enough to wash away the betrayal. I dressed in the same work boots and jeans I'd worn every day for a decade, but they felt foreign now, like a costume for a role I didn't want to play anymore. In the kitchen, Isla was waiting, her eyes red from crying. "Logan, please, let's talk about this," she pleaded. I shook my head. "Not now," I said, my voice flat. I picked up the folder and left the house. As I walked to my truck, the early morning air felt cold and sharp. I climbed in, started the engine, and glanced back at the house. For the first time in a long time, I realized I didn't belong there. I wasn't part of the family I'd built my life around. I was just the hired help, good enough to build someone else's future, but never my own. With the folder on the seat beside me, I drove toward the horizon, the rising sun a promise of something better, something I'd have to build for myself. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least it was mine. Sunday dinner had always been a tradition in the Redmond household, an elaborate affair with Gerald at the head of the table, carving meat with the same precision he expected on the construction sites. Miriam would fuss over side dishes, Isla would set the table, and Paul would usually roll in late, charming everyone with a lopsided grin and stories of creative meetings that more often than not sounded like pub crawls. I'd always accepted it, the family dinners, the illusion of unity. But this Sunday was different. The folder with the ownership documents felt like a grenade in my briefcase, its weight a constant reminder that I'd been building a future for a man who'd never put in the work. I'd spent the entire afternoon rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd say it, where I'd place the folder so that no one could pretend it didn't exist. My palms were damp as I parked outside the house. Isla was already inside, no doubt helping her mother. I could see the warm glow of the dining room lights through the window, could almost hear the laughter. The sound felt foreign, like a language I no longer understood. I rang the doorbell instead of using my key, a small gesture but a meaningful one. Miriam opened the door, her eyes crinkling in that practiced smile she'd mastered over the years. "Logan, come in. Dinner's almost ready." She leaned in for a hug. I returned stiffly. Inside, the house smelled of rosemary and roasted meat, a comforting scent that made my stomach twist with resentment. Paul was already at the table, his sleeves rolled up, a glass of bourbon in hand. He gave me that grin that had always seemed so easy for him, like life never hit him too hard. "Logan, glad you could make it. We've got lamb tonight, Dad's special recipe." I didn't answer, just set my briefcase beside my chair. Isla looked up from the table setting, her eyes soft, searching. I tried to give her a smile, but I knew it probably looked like a grimace. Gerald was in his usual spot at the head, carving knife gleaming as he sliced through the meat with practiced ease. "Logan," he said, voice warm. "I was hoping we could talk about the Mitchell side after dessert." "Sure." I lied, though we both knew that wasn't why I'd come. Dinner was served with the usual flourish. Miriam moved around the table, ladling mashed potatoes onto plates, Gerald carving meat, and passing slices like a priest distributing sacraments. Paul laughed too loud at his own jokes. Isla smiled politely, and I felt like a ghost at a wake. The conversation droned on around me. Some new supplier, a potential investment in a commercial complex on the east side, the cost of steel fluctuating. I let it wash over me, each word a reminder of the world I'd given everything to and the people who'd taken it for granted. Dessert came, Miriam's signature lemon tart. She set it in front of me with a flourish, a proud smile on her face. "Logan, I know it's your favorite," she said, and for a brief second, I wondered if any of this had been real. But then I remembered the folder. The betrayal. The signatures that proved I was nothing but a cog in a machine built for Paul. I reached for my briefcase. The conversation stumbled to a halt as the metal clasp clicked open. I pulled out the folder and laid it in the center of the table, between the tart and the coffee cups. The room felt like it had lost all its oxygen. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. Gerald's hand froze halfway to the bourbon decanter. Miriam's lips parted but no sound came out. Paul looked from me to the folder like he'd never seen it before, though I doubted he was that good of an actor. "Logan, let's not do this here," Gerald said, voice low, the same tone he'd used on job sites when he wanted to keep the peace. "No," I said, my voice louder now, my hands trembling with anger. "We're going to do this here. Because this is where you made me believe I was part of this family. This is where I spent 10 years thinking my work meant something to you." Isla reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. I needed to stand on my own tonight. Gerald cleared his throat. "It's not what it looks like," he said, but the words felt like a slap. "You gave Paul the company," I said, gesturing to the folder. 75%. The rest between you and Miriam. Nothing for me. 10 years of 70-hour weeks, of bringing in clients you couldn't get on your own, of fixing mistakes and holding this place together. And I don't even get a mention. "He's a Redmond by blood," Miriam said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit harder than I expected. "I've worked here longer than he's held a hammer," I shot back. Paul tried to speak, but I cut him off with a look. He had nothing to say that I wanted to hear. The table was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. My chest felt like it might cave in. I looked at Isla, her eyes full of tears she hadn't shed yet, and I saw the truth. She wasn't going to fight for me. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she didn't know how. But either way, I was on my own. I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the tile floor. If Paul owns it, I said, each word a dagger, then Paul can run it. I turned without another glance and walked out the door, the folder still on the table, a bomb that would keep ticking long after I was gone. Outside, the night air was cold against my skin, sharp enough to cut. I walked to my truck, each step heavier than the last. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from a project manager about tomorrow's schedule. I didn't answer. I didn't know them that anymore. As I started the engine, I looked back at the house. Through the window, I saw the family I'd thought I'd been a part of, still sitting around that table, staring at the folder like it was a foreign object. Maybe it was. Maybe I'd always been the outsider, the hired help who never got a real seat at the table. I shifted into drive and pulled away, the gravel crunching under the tires, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. A part of me wanted to go back, to scream, to demand an explanation that would make it all make sense. But deep down, I knew there wasn't one. I've been building someone else's future all along. And tonight, I decided I was done. Monday morning arrived like a slap I should have seen coming. The sun rose, as if mocking me for thinking the world might pause to acknowledge my absence. But the reality was stark. Redmond and Sons didn't skip a beat. I'd given that place every part of me for a decade, and now that I was gone, it hummed along without me. Or at least, that's what I told myself as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I'd never called in sick, never missed a site meeting, never once said no to Gerald's last-minute demands. But today, I didn't show up. No alarm, no coffee, just me and the echo of the words I'd left hanging in the air the night before. If Paul owns it, Paul can run it. By mid-morning, my phone vibrated against the nightstand like it had something urgent to say. I let it ring. I could almost see Gerald at his desk, jaw tight, calling me son, in that condescending way he'd mastered when he wanted something. The calls kept coming, each vibration a reminder of the expectations I'd been trained to meet. But I wasn't that man anymore. I didn't owe them a single breath of my time. Tuesday brought more calls, dozens of them. Emails too, subject lines screaming in all caps. Where's the site audit report? Client walkthrough Thursday? We need the Mitchell project update. I deleted them all without reading. I imagined Paul sitting in my office, spinning in my chair like a kid, clueless about the systems I'd built, the relationships I'd nurtured, the mess I'd always cleaned up. Maybe now he'd see the difference between being handed a title and earning it. On Wednesday, Gerald's name lit up my screen. I watched the phone ring, my thumb hovering over the answer button. A part of me, a part that had grown up believing loyalty was everything, wanted to pick up, to fix the problem, to save the day like I always had. But I didn't owe them that. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. His voice came through, tight and controlled, like a man trying to sound calm while everything around him burned. "Logan," he began, "we need you on the Mitchell site. You're the only one who knows the specs. The inspectors are scheduled for Friday. Please, call me back." I stared at the phone, his voice replaying in my mind. The Mitchell site had been my baby. I designed it from the ground up, from the first sketches to the final walkthroughs. I knew every bolt, every measurement, every adjustment. But none of that had mattered when they handed the keys to Paul. I set the phone down and walked away. Let them figure it out. If Paul wanted to play boss, he could start by cleaning up the mess he'd inherited. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced before. My days used to be filled with the steady beat of construction hammering, saws whining, the murmur of voices over the sound of machinery. Now, there was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock. I wasn't sure if I hated it or needed it. I'd spent so long on autopilot, always working, always fixing, always moving, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist. For the first time in years, I slept past 6. I made coffee and actually drank it while it was still hot. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at a world I'd neglected in favor of blueprints and project timelines. I noticed the way the sunlight hit the neighbor's fence, the birds darting between branches, the leaves fluttering in the breeze. Small things, maybe, but things I hadn't given myself permission to see in too long. I wondered how I'd let it happen, how I'd let a company become my identity, how I convinced myself that loyalty meant sacrificing everything else. I thought about Isla, about the times she'd asked me to come to bed, to put the laptop away, to just be her husband for a night. I thought about the dinners I'd missed, the birthdays I'd postponed, the friends who'd stopped calling because I was always at work. I realized I didn't know who I was without Redmond and Sons. That thought scared me more than losing the job ever could. Because if I wasn't the man who saved every project, who answered every call, who fixed every problem, who was I? That night, I made myself dinner, something simple, something I'd usually be too tired to bother with. I stood at the stove, stirring a pot of pasta, and let the steam rise and fog my glasses. It felt good to do something for myself, even if it was small. I ate at the table instead of the counter. I even let myself enjoy it. I washed the dishes slowly, one by one, and when I finished, I leaned against the sink and looked around the kitchen like I'd never seen it before. This was my space. My home. Not a side office or a boardroom or Gerald's dinner table. Mine. That night, I sat on the couch and flipped through old notebooks, scribbled plans, half-finished designs, ideas I'd had for years but never pursued because I was too busy being the man Redmond and Sons needed me to be. I felt a spark in my chest, faint but warm. Maybe I could be more than the guy who cleaned up everyone else's messes. Maybe I could build something for myself. On Thursday morning, I woke up and didn't check my phone. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and started writing a list. Things I'd learned, things I'd built, things I wanted. I didn't know what would come of it, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for me. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood on my porch and watched the world move on without me. It felt strange, like stepping out of a movie I'd been cast in but never wanted the lead role for. I thought of Gerald and Paul, scrambling to cover the holes I'd left behind. I thought of the clients who'd call and demand answers. I wondered if they'd realize the difference between the man who kept the company afloat and the boy who'd been handed the keys. And for the first time, I felt something like freedom. A small voice inside me asked the question I'd been too afraid to consider for 10 years. Was it really loyalty that kept me at Redmond and Sons, or was it fear of leaving? I stood there until the streetlights flickered on, a soft glow against the darkness. My phone sat inside, silent, ignored. And in that quiet, I made a promise to myself. I'd never be afraid to walk away again. I was up before sunrise, my mind restless in that anxious way it always was when a new plan was forming. My resignation had been on my mind for weeks, but the folder had made it impossible to ignore. It was time to act, but not without strategy. I knew Gerald well enough to understand that a single move could collapse the house of cards he'd built. So I spent the morning organizing my thoughts, laying out every client I'd brought in, every system I'd created, every cost-saving initiative that had kept Redmond and Sons afloat while Paul played at being a creative director. I wasn't going to leave quietly. I was going to make sure that when I walked out that door, they'd feel the loss in every corner of the business. I called Jared Lowe. He'd been a project manager with me years ago, smart, honest, one of the few people who'd never treated me like an outsider in the family business. He'd left Redmond and Sons after clashing with Gerald over safety protocols, but he'd landed on his feet, starting his own construction firm that was already making waves in the industry. Jared answered on the first ring. "Logan," he said, his voice warm, with that easy confidence I'd always respected. "I heard you made waves at dinner the other night." I let out a small laugh, more bitter than amused. "You could say that. Paul's in over his head, and Gerald's desperate to keep me on the hook. I need a way out." "Come join me," Jared said, without hesitation. "I've been watching your work for years. You're the one who made Redmond profitable after 2019. You're the reason half their clients stuck around. I'd be lucky to have you on my team." His words hit harder than I expected. They weren't just a lifeline. They were the first honest acknowledgement of my worth I'd heard in years. "I need to do this right," I said. "No bridges burned, but no loose ends either." "Smart," Jared said. "Come by the office this afternoon. We'll talk terms." I spent the next few hours going through every project file I'd ever touched. I made lists of the clients I'd landed and nurtured, the suppliers I'd negotiated with, the schedules I'd rescued from disaster. Every time a site manager thanked me for saving his job, every time a client sent a handwritten note praising my attention to detail, I documented it all. I wasn't going to leave Gerald any illusions about how essential I'd been. Then I moved on to the systems I'd implemented. The streamlined permit processes that cut delays by weeks, the safety protocols that had dropped accident rates by half, the cost management spreadsheets that had saved millions over the years. I knew Paul couldn't replicate any of it. He didn't have the patience or the skill. But they were mine, and I wasn't going to let them be buried under his mismanagement. By noon, I had everything compiled, neatly labeled, backed up on a flash drive, and stored in the cloud. It felt like armor, a record of every hour I'd sacrificed for a company that had never planned to share the rewards. At 2 o'clock, I met Jared at his office. The space was modern but comfortable, glass walls, reclaimed wood beams, an open floor plan that buzzed with energy. It felt alive in a way Redmond and Sons never had. Jared welcomed me with a grin. "Logan, let's make this official." He handed me a folder with the offer. Director of Operations, a salary that dwarfed Gerald's last-minute bribes, shares in the company, full creative input, and, most important, respect. It was everything I'd never known I needed. I read it over carefully, asking questions about project scopes, team structures, and the expectations he'd have of me. Jared answered every one without hesitation. He wanted a partner, not a pawn. And that felt like a revelation. "Look, I know you're still sorting through the Redmond mess," Jared said. "But I want you to know, whatever decision you make, you've got a place here." I nodded, grateful but also resolute. "I'm ready. I'm giving them my resignation tomorrow. Effective immediately." Jared clapped my shoulder. "You're making the right choice." Driving home, the weight in my chest started to ease, like a chain had been lifted. I wasn't just leaving a job, I was reclaiming my life. That night, I drafted my resignation letter. I kept it factual, clinical, the way Gerald liked things. No emotion, no accusations, just the truth. I wrote, "Effective immediately. No hard feelings. Just facts. Please redirect all inquiries to Paul Redmond." I reread it 3 times, ensuring it carried the finality I intended. I imagined Gerald reading it, the blood draining from his face as he realized he'd lost the one person who'd kept his house of cards from falling. The next morning, I walked into the office for the last time. The place smelled of sawdust and stale coffee. The receptionist looked up, startled, as I handed her the letter. "Please put this on Gerald's desk," I said, my voice calm. She took it with trembling hands. "Is everything okay, Logan?" I gave her a small, sad smile. "It will be." I turned and walked out, the weight of a decade's worth of expectations falling away with each step. Outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about site audits or client meetings or last-minute changes. I was thinking about me. I walked to my truck and climbed in, the engine purring to life like it knew it was time for a new chapter. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Gerald's voice would come, I knew. The desperate calls, the last-ditch offers, the guilt trips. But I'd made my choice. I wasn't the man who stayed out of loyalty anymore. I was the man who walked away on his own terms. And that was worth more than every paycheck they'd ever written. Day 4. That's how long it took for the calls to start coming in from the people who actually mattered, the clients. It wasn't the first morning after my resignation that felt real, or even the second. No, it was day 4, when the phone started ringing and the messages piled up, and my absence finally hit the lifeblood of Redmond and Sons Construction. The first call came in as I was pouring my second cup of coffee in my small kitchen, the sun just beginning to edge over the rooftops. The name on the screen made my heart skip. Macklin Price, CEO of Priceworks Construction. The single largest client we'd landed, a man with a reputation for precision and a temper that could torch bridges in seconds. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity and a hint of defiance won out. "Logan, why the hell aren't you on the Morley project?" Macklin's voice was sharp, the kind of tone that demanded answers, not excuses. I took a slow breath. "I'm on leave," I said evenly, though the word felt too soft for what had happened. "Leave?" he barked. "Hell, you're the only reason I stuck with Redmond after the fiasco in 2019. Paul's fumbling the plans like a rookie. Deadlines are off. Subcontractors are calling me, asking who's in charge. I need you on this." His words were both a compliment and a dagger. I knew I was the reason Priceworks had stayed loyal through the lean years. I was the reason they'd expanded their contract with us after that major warehouse deal fell through. And now I was the one who'd left them stranded with Paul. "I'm sorry, Macklin," I said, my voice low but firm. "I'm not with Redmond anymore. You'll have to talk to their new owner." A pause. A sharp exhale. Logan, listen to me. I don't give a damn who owns the paperwork. I trust you. I need you. If you're going somewhere else, call me first. I stared at the floor, a knot forming in my chest. All those years, all those nights making sure Priceworks was satisfied, that their specs were met, that their money was well spent. It hadn't been for Redmond and Sons. It had been for me. When the call ended, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. I could still hear Macklin's voice. I'd rather talk to you. The words hung heavy, a truth I'd refused to face for too long. They didn't respect Redmond and Sons. They respected me. The realization was a gut punch. I'd been the one patching every leak, managing every crisis, balancing every budget. Paul might have been Gerald's son by blood, but I'd been the one clients called in the dead of night when the site lights went out or the foundation cracked. I'd been the one who fixed it all. And now, I was the name they'd follow. By noon, 3 more calls came in. A developer from Bristol Park, frantic about the permits. A supplier from Halden Concrete, worried that Paul hadn't signed off on the new order. An architect I'd worked with for years, asking why the design revisions were behind schedule. Each call confirmed what I already knew. Without me, Redmond and Sons was a shell of its former self. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began to jot down every client I'd personally secured. I listed the projects I'd overseen. The ones that finished on time and under budget. The ones that turned a profit when everyone else thought they'd tank. It was a long list, longer than I'd let myself believe. And each name came with a memory. Macklin's surprise when I'd solved that steel delivery issue in record time. The smile on Miranda King's face when her boutique hotel came in $400,000 under budget. The way Gerald had shaken my hand and said, "You're the reason this company's still standing." Except now, none of that mattered to him. He'd handed everything to Paul without so much as a conversation with me. The doorbell rang just as I was adding the final name to the list. I opened it to find Jared Lowe standing there, a coffee in one hand, a grin on his face. "Morning, Logan," he said, stepping inside. "You look like you've been doing some thinking." I held up the pad. "The clients are already calling. They're panicking." Jared nodded, his eyes sharp. "That's because they trust you. They've always trusted you. I've got a plan." He laid out his idea, quick and confident, the way I'd always admired about him. "We'll start small. You come on board officially next week, and we reach out to these clients, offer them the stability they're missing. You already know their needs. I'll handle the logistics. You handle the relationships." I shook my head slowly, a grin pulling at the corners of my mouth. "It's crazy how fast this is happening." "It's not crazy," Jared said. "It's karma." The next day, Macklin called again. "Logan," he said, voice calm but urgent, "I've got a problem. Paul's not returning my calls. The Morley site is behind schedule, and the city's threatening to pull the permit. I need someone who knows what they're doing." I let the silence hang for a beat. "Macklin," I said, "I'm not with Redmond and Sons anymore, but I'm considering new opportunities." Another pause. Then, "If you're serious about that, I'll take my business wherever you go. You've earned that." I hung up, my heart pounding. This wasn't just an exit anymore. This was a shift in the entire landscape. Gerald had given Paul the title, but I had the relationships, and now they were voting with their feet. That night, I sat on my porch as the stars blinked awake in the darkening sky. For the first time, I saw a future I could build with my own hands. No strings, no inherited debts, no false promises. Just me and the clients who trusted me because of who I was, not whose son I'd married into. As I closed my eyes, I felt a smile spread across my face. Let Paul handle the pressure now. Let him explain to Gerald why the foundation he'd taken for granted was crumbling. I'd built it once. I could build it again. This time, it would be mine. Friday evening found me back at my apartment, a quiet I'd never known pressing against my eardrums. The kind of silence that felt like a test, like the universe asking me, "Are you really going to stand your ground?" I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, my phone silent on the counter. I hadn't called Isla, hadn't texted Gerald or Miriam. I'd barely answered Jared, and even then, it was only to say I'd need a couple more days before I could officially start. I was determined to let them sweat, to let the emptiness of my absence sink in. It didn't take long. Around 7 o'clock, a knock rattled my door. Not the polite kind. This was urgent, desperate. I didn't need a peephole to know who it was. Gerald Redmond. He'd never come to my place before, always preferring his kingdom at the office or the pristine fortress of his house. But here he was, at my door, looking like a man who'd finally felt the crack in his foundation. I opened the door slowly. Gerald's face was flushed, his tie crooked, hair mussed. He was holding a manila folder in one hand, his other clenched like he was trying to hold back an apology he'd never learned how to give. "Logan," he said, voice taut. "We need to talk." I let the door swing wider, wordlessly stepping back to let him in. The smell of bourbon followed him, and I wondered if he'd had a drink or two before deciding to come over. He set the folder on the table like it was a bomb defused, waiting for my approval to disarm. "Paul doesn't understand the permits," he started, his tone a mix of frustration and regret. "He's messed up the Bristol quote. Macklin's threatening to pull out, and we're already over budget." I watched him like he was a stranger, like I was learning him for the first time. This was the same man who'd smiled when I'd saved the Mitchell project from disaster. The same man who'd called me son in the break room before handing the keys to Paul without a second thought. "So call Paul," I said, my voice even, giving him a taste of the cold professionalism he'd always demanded of me. "He's the heir, right? Let him figure it out." Gerald's eyes flashed. "Don't be like that, Logan. You know he's not ready. You're the only one who understands the Mitchell specs. You're the only one the subcontractors respect. And whose fault is that?" I shot back, my voice sharper now. "You chose him. You gave him everything I built without asking me. You made your choice. Now live with it." He slumped into the chair opposite me, his face deflating like a balloon. "I'll double your salary," he said, like that was the magic one to make this all disappear. "Name it, Logan. I'll make it happen. We need you." I laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Too late," I said. "You should have thought about that before you signed the ownership papers. You made me invisible." He scrubbed a hand over his face, looking 10 years older than he had just a week ago. "Then tell me what you want," he said finally, voice hoarse. I leaned back, the kitchen chair creaking beneath me. I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head 100 times, but now that it was here, the words came easily, like they'd been waiting for this moment. 40% ownership," I said evenly. "A seat on the board. Standard hours, no more of these 80-hour weeks that keep me away from my own life. And a proper contract that respects what I've built." Gerald's eyes widened, and he leaned forward. 40%? That's not possible." I didn't blink. "Then Redmond and Sons falls apart. Or adapts." He stared at me, searching for weakness, but I didn't flinch. I'd spent too long carrying his empire on my back, too long patching up Paul's mistakes and swallowing my pride. I'd given them every ounce of my loyalty, and they'd handed me nothing but empty promises and long hours. I let the silence stretch until it felt like a bridge that might crack under the weight of all the unspoken truths. "You think I'm bluffing," I said finally. "But I'm not. I've already got offers, Gerald. Better offers. Ones that value me for who I am, not who I married." He shook his head, disbelief etched in the lines around his mouth. "You'd really leave it all behind?" I stood, leaning forward just enough to look him dead in the eye. "I already did," I said. His mouth opened like he wanted to argue, but no words came. Instead, he stood slowly, like a man unsteady on new legs, the folder trembling in his grasp. "I'll talk to Miriam," he said at last, his voice small. We'll see what we can do." I didn't say goodbye as he shuffled to the door. I watched him go, the air between us heavy with the weight of 10 years' worth of sacrifice he'd never fully seen. When the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My heart pounded, but it wasn't with fear, it was with resolve. For the first time, I wasn't chasing his approval. I wasn't fighting for a place at a table that had never been mine. I was standing in my own space, in my own home, setting my own terms. The phone on the counter buzzed, a message from Jared. "Hope you're holding your ground," it read. "We're ready whenever you are." I typed back, "I'm done waiting. Let's build something real." I set the phone down and looked around my apartment. It wasn't fancy, no granite countertops or vaulted ceilings. But it was mine. And in that moment, it felt like the only place I wanted to be. I thought of Isla, of the way her eyes had brimmed with tears at the dinner table, of the way she'd always defended Paul in small ways she probably hadn't even noticed. I wondered what she'd say when she found out I wasn't coming back, not the same way, not the same man. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew one thing. I'd never work for free again. I'd never let another man's name on a letterhead define my worth. And as I finished my coffee, I knew I'd never feel small in my own skin again. The morning sun streamed through the blinds like a promise I wasn't sure I believed in yet. I'd barely finished my coffee when my phone lit up with a message from Jared. It's official. Director of Operations. The offer's on the table. My chest tightened. The words felt like the first breath after being held underwater for too long. I read them twice, then let the smile break across my face. It was happening. The respect I'd worked a decade to earn was finally within reach, and from someone who valued it. An hour later, Jared called. I want to make this real, he said, his voice steady and sure. Salary's higher than Gerald's offer, plus shares in the company. I need you running operations, just like you did at Redmond. But this time, it's yours. His confidence felt like a lifeline. You'd have a real seat at the table, Logan. No one's going to hand your work to their son. I swallowed hard, the past few days of anger and doubt tightening in my throat. I'm in, I said, my voice calm but resolute. I'll make it official, but I owe it to myself to give them one last chance to make things right. He paused, then exhaled. 48 hours. That's it. Agreed, I replied. I hung up and set the phone down on the counter. My apartment was silent, the air thick with the weight of decisions. I thought about Isla, about the nights we'd stayed up dreaming of a future built on trust and family. I thought about Gerald, the man who'd taught me to measure twice and cut once, who'd taught me to think like a craftsman but acted like a king. I wondered if he'd ever see that his kingdom was built on the backs of men like me. That evening, I drafted the email. Subject, offer pending, 48 hours. I kept it short, no bitterness, just business. I wrote, effective Sunday at midnight, I will accept the position offered by Jared Low Construction unless Redmond and Sons offers me a fair ownership stake and a seat at the table. 40%. Standard hours. Board representation. Respect. I read it once, twice. Then I hit send. The hours crawled by. I went for a run, let the sweat wash away the frustration, but every step felt like a countdown. I imagined Gerald reading the email, his face turning red, his hand trembling. I imagined Paul smirking in that careless way of his, thinking I was bluffing. Let them think that. Let them think I didn't have the backbone to leave. Saturday came and went in a blur. No calls. No messages. Silence, a tactic I recognized all too well. Gerald's way of controlling the narrative. But this time, it wasn't going to work. Sunday morning arrived with the weight of a final sunrise. I was drinking my coffee when a knock rattled the door. I opened it to find Isla standing there, her hair pulled back, eyes red from tears. She'd always worn loyalty like a badge, her family's silent protector. But now she looked small, like the walls she'd built around her heart had crumbled. Logan, she said, her voice breaking. Please, don't do this. I held the door open, but I didn't step aside. I'm not the one who did this, I said, the words calm but ironclad. Your father did. The moment he gave everything I built to Paul without a word. Tears streamed down her face. He's sorry, she whispered. He's scared. He knows he made a mistake. I shook my head slowly. He's scared because he's losing control, Isla. He's scared because he knows he can't fix this without me. She reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. I can't be the man who fixes everything for them anymore, I said. I have to be the man who fixes things for me. Her shoulders sagged, the fight leaving her eyes. So that's it, she whispered. I nodded. That's it. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway with a heart that felt both heavy and free. By noon, Gerald's email arrived. I opened it, scanning the words. We agree to your terms. 40%. Board seat. Standard hours. My hands trembled, not from relief, but from the realization that it had taken me leaving for him to see my worth. I called Jared. I'm in, I said. But on my terms. He laughed. Damn right. As I hung up, I felt the weight of a decade lift off my shoulders. I'd fought for respect, for my own name on the door, for the dignity I'd always given others but rarely received. And now, I had it. The sun shone bright through the window, a promise of days to come, days where I'd own my seat at the table, where no one would ever again mistake my loyalty for servitude. The morning of the meeting dawned bright, but my mood felt like the air before a storm, charged and brittle. I sat at the kitchen table with a black coffee, the documents in front of me like the last pieces of a puzzle I'd been forced to solve on my own. Every word, Every clause had been reviewed, every line a reminder of what I'd fought for. 40% ownership, a seat on the board, standard hours, respect, though that wasn't a line in the contract. It was something I had to claim for myself. I'd given Gerald 48 hours. He'd taken every one of them. And now, here we were. When I pulled into the neutral meeting space, a small, modern conference room downtown, my stomach twisted. Gerald was already there, his suit impeccable as ever, though the lines on his face looked deeper than I remembered. Miriam sat next to him, hands folded, lips pressed tight. Paul, predictably, was slouched in his chair, eyes darting between his phone and the door like a kid waiting for the bell to ring. Isla sat beside Paul, her gaze downcast, as though she couldn't decide which side of the table she belonged on. I walked in with my attorney at my side, a move that made Gerald's jaw tighten. I'd learned the hard way that words were easy to bend, but signatures on a page meant accountability. "Logan," Gerald said, his voice strained but polite. "Let's get this done." I took a seat opposite him, laid my folder on the table, and met his eyes. "Here are my terms," I said, sliding the document across. "They're non-negotiable." Gerald's lips twitched, a muscle jumping in his jaw as he read. 40%, he muttered, like the number was poison. "A board seat. Standard hours," I added. "No more 70-hour weeks. I've earned my place, and I'm not giving it away." Paul shifted uncomfortably. He looked pale, the usual cocky smirk nowhere in sight. He'd been thrown into a job he couldn't handle, and we both knew it. Gerald glanced at him, then at Miriam, then back at me. "And if I say no?" he asked, though his voice lacked the usual bite. "Then I walk," I said, my voice flat and steady. "And your biggest clients walk with me." The room fell silent, the weight of that truth settling like dust on every surface. Even Paul knew what that meant. I'd spent a decade building relationships that Redmond and Sons now depended on like air. Without me, they'd suffocate. Gerald sighed, rubbing his temples like he could massage the reality away. "We've built a legacy here, Logan," he tried, but the words felt as hollow as an abandoned job site. I shook my head. "You build a legacy on the backs of people like me," I said, my tone firm but even. "And I'm done carrying the load for free." Miriam's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Isla reached for Paul's hand, but he pulled away, his gaze locked on the table. My lawyer cleared his throat and slid the final version of the agreement across the table. "We're ready to sign," he said. Gerald stared at it like it might bite him. Then he picked up the pen, his hand trembling just enough to catch my eye. "This isn't how I wanted things to go," he muttered, signing his name. I took the pen and signed without hesitation. The ink felt final, a line between the man I'd been and the man I was choosing to become. My lawyer gathered the documents, nodding at me. "Congratulations," he said quietly. I leaned back, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Paul finally looked up, his face pale. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice small. "Now," I said, turning to him with a calmness that surprised me. "Now you stay in creative strategy, where you belong. I manage execution. We share responsibilities, but I won't be cleaning up your messes anymore." He nodded, but the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. He'd never wanted the weight, only the title. Gerald shifted, his face a mixture of defeat and reluctant respect. "You'll stay?" he asked, almost a plea. I met his gaze and felt a strange sort of pity. "I'll stay," I said, "but only because I earned it. This company needs a leader, not a figurehead." The meeting ended with a handshake I didn't return. As I walked out, Isla caught my arm, her eyes shining. "Logan," she whispered, voice thick. "I'm proud of you. I hope you know that." I paused, the weight of all the years between us pressing down. "Thank you," I said softly. But it's time I was proud of myself, too. Outside, the air felt different, crisp, clean, as though I'd finally stepped into a world where I owned my choices. My phone buzzed, a message from Jared. "Welcome to the next chapter." I smiled, sliding the phone back into my pocket. For the first time in 10 years, I felt like I wasn't just part of someone else's plan. I was building my own. And whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain: I'd earned my place at the table. The months that followed felt like stepping into a world that had always been waiting for me, just beyond the reach of that office door I'd shut behind me at Redmond and Sons. I walked into the building on that first Monday morning with my head high, a new nameplate waiting for me on the conference room table, one that finally carried the weight of everything I'd built: Logan Pierce, Director of Operations. The staff paused their conversations as I walked past, their eyes wide with questions that no one dared ask out loud. I saw the uncertainty in Paul's eyes as he tried to smile and pretend the arrangement didn't bother him. But the truth was, it did. And it should. I'd earned every inch of the ground I now stood on. My first act was to call a staff meeting. I stood at the front of the room, the sun streaming through the tall windows, casting everything in a clear light that felt fitting. Paul hovered near the back, hands jammed in his pockets, shifting from foot to foot like a kid at detention. I met every gaze directly, letting them see the steadiness in my eyes. Effective today, I began, my voice carrying the authority they'd never given me before, but that I'd always had. We're restructuring the way this company operates. I will oversee all site operations, including project management, client relations, and staff training. Paul will focus on creative strategy, marketing, and community outreach. A murmur swept through the room. I saw a few heads nodding, relief plain on their faces. They'd all seen the chaos that followed when Paul tried to step into my shoes. I paused, giving them a moment to absorb the shift. Redmond & Sons has always been a family business, I continued. But today, we're building a professional business, one that respects experience, dedication, and results. That starts with accountability and a clear chain of command. Paul shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't speak. He knew he'd lost that right when he'd let the company slip through his fingers. Gerald wasn't in the room. He'd retreated to his office, letting me clean up the mess like I always had. But that was fine. He'd had his chance to lead. Now it was my turn. After the meeting, I walked the halls like a man finally home. Each office, each site plan, each nervous glance from the staff. These were all pieces of a puzzle I'd been assembling for a decade. I stopped by Macklin Price's file, flipping through the notes and contract revisions I'd made over the years. Without me, the Morley project would have collapsed. And that was the truth Gerald and Paul had never wanted to face. That afternoon, Paul knocked on my office door. He stood in the doorway, hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. "Hey," he said, his voice small. "Got a minute?" I motioned him in. He sat across from me, his eyes downcast. For a moment, I saw the kid he'd been, full of charm, sure, but also overwhelmed by the weight of expectations he hadn't earned. "You were right to walk away," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't ready. I don't think I'll ever be ready for all of this." I nodded, letting the silence stretch. "Then be honest about what you can handle," I said. "And let me handle the rest." He nodded, a flicker of relief passing over his face. "Thanks," he said, his voice trembling. I watched him go, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger or resentment. Just a quiet understanding that sometimes the crown fits the one who actually does the work, not the one born to wear it. Sunday dinner came around again, but this time it felt different. Gerald sat at the head of the table, his posture a little slumped, his eyes wary as he watched me carve the roast. Miriam kept the conversation polite, asking about Isla's work, the neighbor's new fence, anything but the elephant in the room. Isla sat beside me, her hand on my arm, her eyes warm and steady. Halfway through dinner, Gerald raised his glass. His voice cracked as he said, "To Logan, for showing us what leadership really looks like." The table fell silent, everyone waiting for me to react. I met his eyes, a steady calm in my chest. I nodded once, accepting the words without letting them define me. I didn't need his approval anymore. I had my own. After dinner, I stood at the window, watching the yard fade into twilight. Isla joined me, her arm slipping around my waist. "You did it," she whispered. I leaned into her touch. "I had to," I said. "For me. For everyone who ever felt invisible." She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm proud of you." I turned to face her, my heart full in a way I hadn't let it be in years. "I'm proud of me too." Outside, the world carried on, cars passing, dogs barking, lights flickering on in neighbors' homes. But inside, I felt a peace I'd never known before. A certainty that I'd earned my place at this table, that I'd carved my own seat from sweat and sacrifice. And I promised myself one thing: I'd never work for free again.